My name is Edward Collins, and for most of my life I believed that building my dream home would be the happiest chapter I'd ever write. I poured my savings, my sweat, and my heart into a beautiful two-story house at the edge of a quiet suburban gorge. It wasn't just walls and windows, it was the place where I imagined raising grandchildren, hosting Sunday barbecues, and finally enjoying the peace I'd worked so hard for, but peace has a way of slipping through your fingers when the wrong neighbor moves in. Across the property line lived Martin Hayes, a man whose cold eyes and stiff smile hid something darker than I could have imagined. At first, it was little things, muttered complaints about tree branches, angry glares if my lawnmower strayed too close to his hedge. I brushed it off. Everyone has quirks, right? Then came the accusation one morning. Martin stormed onto my porch, waving a rolled-up document in his fist. With venom in his voice, he claimed my house was built on his land. Not just an inch or two, but enough that he demanded I tear it down completely. I laughed at first, thinking it was a cruel joke. But the look on his face told me this was only the beginning of a nightmare. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I felt like I had finally stepped into the kind of life people dream about. The street was lined with maple trees that turned fire red every autumn. Kids rode their bikes up and down the sidewalks, their laughter ringing out in the golden light. Neighbors waved when you drove by. And the local HOA sent out cheerful newsletters about bake sales, gardening contests, and block parties. It was the picture of suburban bliss for me. That house wasn't just another real estate investment. It was the culmination of decades of hard work as a civil engineer. I'd spent years traveling from one construction site to another, missing birthdays and anniversaries, stacking up overtime pay, all with one dream in mind, a home where I could finally rest. The property at the edge of town, with its rolling backyard and gentle slope toward a creek, felt perfect when I broke ground. The whole neighborhood seemed supportive. People stopped by to admire the frame as it went up. An elderly couple brought me lemonade while I hammered beams in the summer heat. A young family with twin boys even helped me carry in the first boxes when moving day came, but not everyone was welcoming. That was the first time I met Martin Hayes. He appeared one morning while I was unloading furniture from a rental truck. He was tall and thin and wore a pressed shirt tucked into perfectly ironed trousers, even though the sun was blazing. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place, and his expression carried the permanent scowl of a man who saw the world as an inconvenience. "You're the new owner," he said flatly. Not bothering to introduce himself, I smiled, extending a hand. "Edward Collins." "Nice to meet you." He looked at my hand but didn't take it. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the freshly painted siding of my house. "You know, houses like that don't fit the character of this neighborhood," he muttered. It was an odd remark, especially since my house followed the same design guidelines as everyone else's. Still, I brushed it off. "Well, I'll try to keep it tasteful." That was all the conversation we had. And he turned away, muttering something under his breath as he walked back to his own property. At first, I chalked it up to personality. Every neighborhood has a grump, the one person who thinks they should control the street. I figured if I kept things cordial, Martin and I would eventually find some common ground, but Martin didn't want common ground. He wanted control. It started with petty complaints. One evening, I received a letter in my mailbox, unsigned but typed in bold letters. "Your trash cans are visible from the street. HOA guidelines require them to be hidden." I double-checked the HOA handbook. Trash cans could be placed by the garage as long as they weren't obstructing the sidewalk, which mine weren't. Still, I moved them to the side just to avoid trouble. A week later, another letter appeared. "Your lawn exceeds the neighborhood height standard." Again, false. My grass was freshly cut when I mentioned it to a neighbor across the street. She sighed. That'll be Martin. He does this to everyone. Don't take it personally, but the problem was, Martin did take it personally. One afternoon, while I was planting rosebush along the driveway, he marched over, arms folded. "Those hedges," he barked, "are going to grow over the property line. I suggest you tear them out before they become a nuisance." I blinked at him, sweat dripping down my brow. "They're 3 feet inside my boundary." The survey marked it clearly. "Surveyors make mistakes," he said, his lips curling. "You'll see." I tried to reason with him. "Martin, I'm not here to cause problems. I just want to enjoy my home." "Then don't make me your problem," he snapped before retreating back to his yard that night. I found myself staring out the window, watching the silhouette of his house against the moonlight. His blinds were drawn, but the faint glow of a lamp flickered in his living room. It struck me that I was genuinely uneasy one man, and already he was beginning to poison the peace I'd dreamed of. Still, I convinced myself things would improve. After all, I'd dealt with difficult contractors, stubborn clients, and endless bureaucracy throughout my career. Surely one man couldn't ruin the sanctuary I'd built. I was wrong. The hostility escalated if my car was parked even an inch closer to the shared curb. He would leave notes accusing me of trespassing. If leaves from my oak tree drifted onto his lawn, he would blow them back with a leaf blower, deliberately piling them against my front door. He even called the HOA once, claiming that the paint color of my shutters was non-compliant, though I had the official approval in writing. The HOA board grew tired of him, but Martin was relentless. He wasn't just a complainer. He was a strategist. One autumn afternoon, I came home to find him pacing his driveway, clutching a rolled-up blueprint. When he saw me, his face lit with a chilling smile. "Edward," he called, striding across the lawn as though he owned it. "I've done some digging. It appears your house isn't exactly where it should be." Frowned. "What are you talking about?" He unrolled the blueprint dramatically, flattening it against the hood of his car. "According to county records, the boundary line cuts further into your lot, which means," he tapped a finger on the paper, "a portion of your house is built on my property." I stared at the document. It was old, faded, and looked like something he'd dug out of a dusty archive. "That doesn't make sense." I had a professional survey done before construction. "Everything was cleared. Surveys can be wrong," he repeated, his tone dripping with smugness. I laughed uneasily, trying to brush it off. "Martin, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," but his expression was deadly serious. "I want it corrected. Either you move the structure off my land or you demolish it. Those are your options." I felt my stomach drop. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," he said, rolling up the blueprint and tucking it under his arm. "And if you don't comply, I'll see you in court." The chill in his voice wasn't just anger, it was conviction. He believed he had me trapped that night. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept pacing my living room, replaying the encounter in my head. What if, somehow, there had been a mistake? What if, after all the money and years of dreaming, I really was standing on borrowed ground? But then a thought pierced through the fear. Martin Hayes thrived on intimidation. This wasn't about land. It was about power. And he had just declared war. The next morning I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the survey documents I had filed away years earlier. They were crisp, official, stamped by the county with my name printed clearly across the top. Every line, every measurement had been carefully verified before I'd laid a single brick. Yet Martin's words gnawed at me. What if he's right? I shook the thought away. Logic told me this was absurd. But fear doesn't listen to logic, it feeds on doubt. When I stepped outside, Martin was already waiting. He leaned casually against his mailbox, sipping from a silver thermos as though he had all the time in the world. The moment our eyes met, his lips curled into a smirk. "Morning, Edward," he called. "I hope you slept well. You'll need your rest for the legal battle ahead." I clenched my jaw and ignored him, walking to my car. His laughter followed me down the driveway, sharp and mocking. Later that day, I paid a visit to the county records office. If Martin truly had something, I needed to see it for myself. The clerk, a woman named Patricia, greeted me warmly and listened patiently as I explained the situation. After a few clicks on her computer, she pulled up the digital files. "Your survey is correct," she confirmed, swiveling the screen toward me. "Everything aligns with the official boundaries. Whoever's telling you otherwise is either mistaken or deliberately misreading old records." Relief washed over me. "So he doesn't have a case?" Patricia hesitated. "Not exactly. People can file lawsuits over just about anything. If he wants to drag you into court, he can. But the good news is, you'd have stronger documentation." Her words comforted me. But only slightly. Strong documentation or not, I knew Martin's type. He wouldn't back down, even if the facts weren't on his side. He thrived on conflict, on grinding his opponents down until they broke. Sure enough, within a week, a letter arrived by certified mail. The return address, Martin Hayes'side, was a formal notice of encroachment. He had gone so far as to hire a private surveyor, someone clearly willing to twist the numbers in his favor. According to this new survey, nearly 6 feet of my southern wall extended into his property. His letter demanded immediate removal of the structure, failing which he would pursue demolition through the courts. My hands shook as I read it. 6 feet? That was ludicrous. My original survey had placed the boundary nearly 10 feet from that wall. It wasn't a small margin of error, it was outright fabrication still. The letter had an effect. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors whispered support, telling me not to worry. Others, curious but cautious, began to avoid eye contact. After all, no one wanted to get caught in Martin Hayes' hairs. That evening, as I stood in my driveway, I saw him again. He was pacing his yard like a general inspecting a battlefield. His eyes locked onto me, and he raised a hand in a mock-friendly wave. "You should start packing," he said loudly. Loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "No point in living in a house that doesn't belong to you." Humiliation burned in my chest. I wanted to shout back, to call him the liar he was. But I knew that was exactly what he wanted, a public scene. Instead, I turned and walked inside. Slamming the door behind me alone in my living room, I whispered to myself, "He wants war? Then war he'll get for years." I had designed bridges, highways, and entire city blocks. I knew how to read blueprints, how to spot errors, how to prove what was real and what was fantasy. If Martin wanted a fight, I wasn't going to cower. I was going to beat him at his own game, and so the battle truly began from the moment that letter arrived. Life in my dream home turned into something out of a legal thriller. Every day felt like I was under siege, trapped not just in a house but in a war zone where the battleground was my own backyard. I tried to ignore Martin, but ignoring him only emboldened him. Within days he'd escalated. He hired a contractor to hammer bright orange stakes into what he claimed was the true property line, each stake jabbed into my lawn, like a knife wound. I stood at my window, fists clenched, watching him bark orders as though he already owned the land. When I confronted him, my voice shaking with anger, he simply smirked. "This is legal procedure," he said calmly. "You'll thank me when the courts rule in my favor. It'll save you the trouble of tearing it down yourself." That night I called my lawyer, Janet Wallace, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd worked with during past business contracts. She listened as I explained the situation, then sighed. "Edward, here's the truth," she said. "Anyone can file a claim. Whether it's valid or not, you'll have to defend yourself in court. But don't panic. We'll counter his so-called survey with your official one. Judges don't take kindly to fabricated evidence." Her words steadied me, but my nerves were fraying. I'd worked my whole life for this home. The thought of losing it over some twisted neighbor's vendetta made my stomach churn. The neighborhood began to divide. Some neighbors quietly expressed sympathy, slipping notes into my mailbox. "Hang in there. We know the truth." Others distanced themselves, unwilling to risk Martin's wrath. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, and though they acknowledged Martin's history of complaints, they couldn't intervene in private property disputes. I felt abandoned. One chilly evening, I found myself sitting in my darkened living room, staring at the survey documents spread across my coffee table. My hands traced the clean black lines, the precise numbers that proved my innocence. But proof meant nothing if Martin could twist the narrative before a judge. Then the harassment intensified. Late one night, I was jolted awake by the sound of hammering. I rushed to the window to see Martin pounding another set of stakes into the soil, this time directly against my southern wall. He worked with obsessive determination, his face illuminated by the harsh beam of a floodlight. "Hey!" I shouted, throwing open the window. "You're trespassing." He didn't even flinch. "Not trespassing," he called back smugly. "I'm reclaiming what's mine." I called the police, but when the officer arrived, Martin put on his best innocent act. He produced his falsified survey, waving it like a badge of authority. The officer glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable. "This is a civil dispute," he said finally. "Not a criminal matter. You'll have to sort this out in court." And with that, he drove away, leaving me fuming on my doorstep while Martin smirked in the shadows. The next morning, I discovered that someone who else but Martin had dumped a pile of leaves and trash across my driveway. A petty move, but effective. Each day brought a new tactic, blocking part of the sidewalk with his car, shining floodlights into my windows at night, even blasting music when I tried to host a small gathering of friends. Janet urged me to stay calm. "Document everything," she said firmly. "Take pictures, save every letter, keep a log of incidents." Judges respect records, so I did. My phone is filled with photos, orange stakes, piles of leaves, tire marks, notes slipped under my door. Each image told the story of a man obsessed with domination, but Martin wasn't satisfied with just tormenting me. He wanted to destroy me publicly at the next HO meeting. He stood before the entire board, holding his fake survey like a trophy. "This man has stolen my land," he declared, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's a thief, a liar, and he thinks he can cheat this community." Murmurs rippled through the room. I rose to my feet, my voice firm but steady. "That's a lie. I had an official county survey done before I built. I have the documents right here," but Martin was cunning. He shook his head with mock pity. "Of course he'd say that, but I've hired a licensed surveyor who found otherwise. 6 feet of my property swallowed by his greed. Are we really going to let this stand?" Some neighbors gasped. Others looked at me with doubt in their eyes. At that moment, I realized Martin wasn't just after land, he was after reputation. If he couldn't win legally, he'd win socially. Poisoning my standing until I was isolated, the board tried to mediate, but Martin's theatrics left a stain. I walked out of that meeting feeling smaller, lonelier, angrier than ever, and then the lawsuit arrived, a thick envelope hand-delivered by a process server. Hayes v. Collins, he was officially demanding demolition of the southern portion of my house. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands. My heart pounded, sweat prickling down my back. This wasn't a bluff anymore. It was real. Janet was calm when I called her. "We'll fight this," she assured me. "You have every legal right to that house." His evidence won't hold up under scrutiny, but doubts still gnawed at me. What if the judge sided with him out of caution? What if technicalities outweighed logic? As the weeks dragged on, court filings and motions filled my mailbox. Martin strutted around the neighborhood like a victor before the battle had even begun. He cornered neighbors on sidewalks, spinning lies about me, painting himself as the victim of a selfish intruder. One evening, I overheard him telling a group of residents, I gave him every chance to do the right thing, but he'd rather steal than admit his mistake. Humiliation burned me to the core. I wanted to shout, to confront, to tear down his web of lies. But I knew losing my temper would only feed his narrative. Instead, I turned inward. I gathered every scrap of evidence, every document, every timestamp. I even contacted the surveyor who'd done the original work, asking him to testify if necessary. Through it all, Martin never let up. He prowled the edge of my property like a predator, waiting, watching, smiling that smug smile that haunted my dreams. The battle lines were drawn. The neighborhood was divided. The courts were set, and in the middle of it all, I stood, one man fighting not just for his home, but for his dignity, his peace, and his right to exist without being crushed by the cruelty of a neighbor who thrived on destruction. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and dust, the kind of place where justice wasn't just decided, it was performed. Rows of benches stretched across the room, filled with curious neighbors who'd come to watch the spectacle. Some whispered nervously. Others craned their necks for a better view. I sat at the defendant's table beside Janet, my lawyer, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the aisle sat Martin Hayes, smug as ever, his suit freshly pressed, his hair slicked back with military precision. He whispered to his attorney, occasionally glancing my way with that same mocking smirk I had come to despise. The bailiff called for order, and the judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes named Judge Helen Mercer, took her seat. Her gaze swept the room, instantly commanding silence. "Mr. Hayes," she began, "you are bringing forth a complaint alleging that Mr. Collins's property encroaches on yours by approximately 6 feet. You are seeking demolition of the structure. Is this correct?" Martin rose confidently, his voice dripping with false humility. "Yes, Your Honor, I regret that it has come to this, but the law is the law. My neighbor, Mr. Collins, has built his home in violation of property boundaries, and I am simply seeking restoration of what is rightfully mine." He placed a folder on the table with a dramatic flourish. "Here is the survey conducted by a licensed professional confirming the encroachment." Janet leaned closer to me, whispering, "Relax, his arrogance will be his downfall." When it was our turn, Janet stood gracefully, sliding our documents across the bench. "Your Honor, the defense will show that Mr. Collins followed every legal requirement before constructing his home. He obtained a county-certified survey, filed the plans with the county, and received all necessary approvals. The plaintiff's so-called survey is not only flawed, it directly contradicts official county records. Judge Mercer arched an eyebrow. Flawed how? Janet smiled thinly. We'll demonstrate that shortly. The proceedings began with testimony from Martin's surveyor, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit who avoided eye contact as he spoke. He insisted that his measurements were correct, that the encroachment was undeniable. Martin nodded along eagerly, feeding on every word, but when Janet cross-examined him, the cracks began to show. Mr. Davidson, she said, flipping through his report, could you explain why your survey measurements differ so drastically from the county's? He cleared his throat nervously. Every surveyor has their own methods? Janet pressed. Or motives. Because according to your notes, you failed to use the most recent boundary markers, choosing instead to rely on outdated reference points that no longer exist. Isn't that true? The man stammered, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I used what was available. And who hired you, Mr. Davidson? His voice dropped. Mr. Hayes paid in cash, wasn't it? Janet asked smoothly. The courtroom buzzed. Judge Mercer banged her gavel. Order. Janet allowed the silence to stretch before delivering the blow. Your Honor, this so-called professional survey is not just flawed. It is deliberately manipulated to favor the plaintiff. We will submit the county's official survey into evidence, along with testimony from the licensed surveyor who conducted it. At her signal, a man in a neat blazer stepped forward. It was Mr. Alvarez, the original county surveyor. He testified with calm precision, walking the court through every line, every measurement, every stamped approval. The property was inspected thoroughly, he explained. Boundary markers were located and confirmed. The Collins house sits entirely within legal limits. There is no encroachment whatsoever. Martin's face tightened, his smugness flickering into unease, but Janet wasn't finished. She introduced photographs I had taken of Martin's harassment, the stakes hammered into my lawn, the piles of debris, the mocking gestures caught from across the street. This isn't just unabhorred disagreement, Janet declared, her voice ringing across the chamber. This is a campaign of intimidation, designed to force my client from his lawful home. Mr. Hayes has weaponized the legal system with fabricated evidence to satisfy a personal vendetta. All eyes turned to Martin. He shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. When it was my turn to testify, my heart pounded, but I spoke clearly. I told the court about the months of harassment, the endless letters, the late-night stake driving, the humiliation at the HOA meeting. My voice cracked once, but I steadied myself. I worked my whole life for this house, I said, my throat dry. It isn't just bricks and wood. It's my dream. And I won't let it be destroyed by lies for the first time. I saw doubt flicker in Denibor's eyes, not toward me, but toward Martin. He must have felt it too, because when he took the stand, his composure began to unravel. He ranted about stolen land and entitled outsiders, his voice rising with each word. His attorney tried to calm him, but Martin couldn't stop himself. They all take advantage of me, he shouted, slamming his fist against the witness stand. That land is mine. He doesn't deserve it. None of them do. The room fell silent. His face was red, his hands trembling with fury. Judge Mercer leaned forward, her eyes sharp as steel. Mr. Hayes, control yourself. This is a court of law, not a stage for your temper, but it was too late. His mask had slipped, and everyone had seen what lay beneath. Janet delivered her closing argument with quiet authority. Your Honor, this case is not about property lines. It is about truth versus deceit, stability versus chaos, and the abuse of law by someone who cannot accept reality. We ask that you dismiss this baseless claim and protect Mr. Collins's right to live in peace. The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The entire room held its breath. Finally she returned, her verdict clear and unwavering. This court finds in favor of the defendant. Mr. Collins, the plaintiff's evidence is unreliable and contradicted by official records. The claim of encroachment is dismissed with prejudice. Relief crashed over me like a wave. I exhaled shakily, my shoulders sagging as if a weight had been lifted. Janet squeezed my arm, whispering, "We did it." But Judge Mercer wasn't finished. Furthermore, she said sternly, her gaze fixed on Martin, this court does not take kindly to harassment or misuse of the legal system, Mr. Hayes. Your actions demonstrate bad faith and malicious intent. You will bear all court costs and legal fees incurred by Mr. Collins, Any further harassment will result in immediate restraining orders. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Martin's face drained of color, his smirk gone, replaced by stunned disbelief as the gavel struck, signaling the end of the case. Neighbors rose from their seats. Some clapped softly, others approached me with words of congratulations. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of isolation lifting. Martin, however, stormed out, his eyes blazing with hatred. He shoved past people, muttering curses under his breath. I watched him go, not with fear, but with something else, pity. Because in his desperate attempt to destroy me, he had destroyed himself. The war was over, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like my house was truly my home again. When the gavel struck for the final time and Judge Mercer dismissed Martin's case, I felt a stillness settle over me that I hadn't experienced in months. The relentless anxiety, the sleepless nights, the constant second-guessing, it all began to melt away. I shook Janet's hand firmly. "Thank you," I whispered, the words carrying the weight of everything she had just saved me from. She smiled. "Go home, Edward. Enjoy your house. You've earned it." Those words rang in my ears as I stepped outside the courthouse. The autumn sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like the world was closing in. A few neighbors who had attended the trial approached me, offering hesitant smiles. "Glad justice was served," said Mrs. Whitaker, a kind older woman who lived 2 houses down. "I knew Martin was full of it," muttered George, the retired mechanic from across the street. He extended his hand, and when I shook it, there was no tension, just genuine solidarity. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. For so long, I had felt isolated, like Martin's poisonous words had turned the whole neighborhood against me. Now, it was as if the fog had lifted, and people could see me for who I really was, not an intruder, not a thief of land, but a man who just wanted peace in his own home. When I finally drove back into my neighborhood, the sight of my house waiting at the end of the street nearly brought tears to my eyes. The white siding gleamed in the sunlight. The shutters I had painted with my own hands looked proud and dignified. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a fortress that had survived a siege. I parked in the driveway and stepped out, just standing there, looking at it. Every brick, every nail, every corner of that structure carried my sweat and sacrifice. And now, finally, I knew it was truly safe. As I unlocked the front door, the air inside felt different, lighter. I sat in my favorite armchair and let the silence wash over me. For weeks, that silence had been heavy with dread, punctuated by the sound of Martin hammering stakes or shouting from across the fence. Now it was peaceful, almost sacred. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Where once people had avoided eye contact, now they stopped to chat when I walked to get the mail. Mrs. Whitaker even dropped by with a homemade pie, smiling warmly as she handed it over. "We should have said something sooner," she admitted. "We all saw what Martin was doing, but, well, nobody wanted to get involved." I nodded, understanding more than I cared to admit. "It's hard to stand up to someone like him," I said softly. "But I appreciate this." Word of the court ruling spread quickly. Martin had lost not just his case but also the respect of nearly everyone around him. His once perfect lawn began to look unkempt, weeds sprouting where he used to obsessively mow. His porch light often stayed off, his blinds drawn tight every so often. I would catch him glaring from his window, his bitterness as sharp as ever. But the power he once held over me and over the neighborhood was gone. One Saturday morning, I decided to host a small gathering in my backyard. Nothing extravagant, just coffee, tea, and some pastries. I invited a handful of neighbors, unsure who would actually show up. To my surprise, nearly everyone I asked came. We sat around the patio, sharing stories and laughter. The tension that had once lingered in the air seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sense of community I hadn't felt since moving in. George raised his cup toward me. "To Edward," he said. The man who stood his ground. Everyone clinked their cups, and though my face warmed, my heart swelled with gratitude. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat outside under the stars. For months, I had felt like I was fighting this battle alone. But now I realized that standing my ground had not just defended my home, it had reminded others that silence in the face of bullying only empowers the bully. I thought often about Martin in the days after. His downfall had been spectacular, but it wasn't the victory I felt when I thought of him. It was a pity. How lonely must a man be to dedicate so much of his energy to destroying someone else's life? How broken must he feel to twist the law for revenge? I didn't excuse his actions. I never could. But I no longer carried the anger. Anger is heavy, and I had carried enough of it already instead. I focused on the lessons I had learned, that truth has a way of standing tall, even when lies tower over it for a time, that community matters, even if it takes a crisis to bring it together, and most of all, that a house isn't just wood and nails, it's a symbol of everything you fight for, everything you believe in. That afternoon, as I tended the small garden in my backyard, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass. I looked at my house, its windows gleaming in the sunlight, and felt a deep, uncheckable peace. Martin might still be there, lurking behind his curtains, but he no longer had power over me. His lawsuits, his intimidation, his rage had all crumbled in the face of truth. I knelt to plant a row of flowers along the fence line, a living reminder that even after the harshest storms, new life can bloom. As I stood back to admire my work, I whispered softly to myself, "This is home. And no one can take it from me." For the first time since moving in, those words didn't feel like a promise or a hope. They felt like the truth. Months later, I received a letter from the county. It wasn't another demand or another notice of complaint. It was simply a certificate of compliance, confirming once again that my property was fully within legal bounds. A final seal of validation. I framed it and hung it in my study, not out of spite, but as a reminder. A reminder that battles can be fought and won, even when the odds feel stacked against you. As I sat in that room, sunlight streaming through the curtains, I thought back to the moment when Martin had stormed onto my porch, waving that false survey in my face. I remembered the fear, the anger, and the hopelessness. And then I thought of where I was now, safe, at peace, and stronger than I had ever been. The resolution wasn't just in the court ruling. It was in me. Now I ask you, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have fought back against Martin or walked away to avoid the stress? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
This was just one story, but the next one will be even more dramatic. Are you ready? Then you need to subscribe to HOA Stories 87 right now. Like this video, share it with your friends, and hit the bell because the next story might sound a little too close to home.